At 0909 on February 19, 1945. Corporal Tony Stein did something no Marine on Iwo Jima had ever attempted. He charged straight into the deadliest beach in the Pacific with a weapon he built himself. Not issued. Not approved. Not trusted. Just months earlier, his sergeant told him the idea was insane, a waste of time, a guaranteed way to get himself killed. But on this morning, surrounded by black volcanic sand exploding under machine gun fire, Stein's stupid idea was the only thing keeping him alive. The Japanese had spent years transforming Iwo Jima into a perfect trap. 17,000 defenders hid inside 11 miles of tunnels carved into the rock, watching every inch of the beach through overlapping fields of fire. The moment the Marines landed, the island erupted. Machine guns from invisible pillboxes shredded the first waves. Mortar shells turned entire squads into clouds of ash. By mid-morning, the 5th Marine Division had already taken horrifying losses, and bodies lay scattered across the beach like dark shapes sinking into the volcanic dust. Pinned down, unable to see where the bullets were coming from, most Marines could only hug the ground and pray. But Tony Stein wasn't built for waiting to die. He knew the standard Browning machine guns were too heavy to advance with. He'd watched them slow the pace of entire platoons for months. And unlike most Marines, Stein had a secret advantage. He was a tool maker, problem solver. A man who understood machines like other men understood rifles, so he built his own in the middle of a war. In the middle of a campaign, no one was expected to survive. He built a weapon from aircraft parts that fired 3 times faster than anything a Marine could carry on the most brutal beach of World War II. The Japanese were about to watch one man turn that homemade monster into a nightmare they never saw coming. 3 months before Iwo Jima. The idea of Corporal Tony Stein building his own machine gun sounded like a joke. Back in November 1944, at Camp Tarawa in Hawaii, Stein watched the same problem repeat itself during every training exercise. Riflemen advanced. Browning machine gun teams tried to follow. But the moment the heavy M1919s were set up, the line was already moving again. Break them down, drag them forward, set them up again, fall behind again. Momentum died. Opportunities vanished. And Stein, a man who had spent his youth shaping steel in his father's Dayton workshop, couldn't ignore an engineering flaw that was killing Marines. Stein wasn't born a warrior. He was born a builder. The son of Austrian Jewish immigrants. He learned to cut metal at Patterson Field before becoming a tool-and die maker at Dello Products. Machines made sense to him. He could see their limits before he touched them. So when Sergeant Mel Gravich approached him one night with a strange request, Stein already knew he wasn't being asked to fix a weapon. He was being asked to reinvent one. Gravich had recovered an MN-2 aircraft machine gun from a wrecked Dauntless dive bomber during the Bougainville campaign. It was light, fast, and brutally effective in the air, firing more than 1,000 rounds a minute. But in the hands of a Marine on the ground, it was useless. No stock, no trigger suited for infantry, no sights, no stability. Just raw firepower locked inside the wrong shape. Stein saw potential. They worked in secret inside a dim maintenance shed long after the rest of the company slept, cutting, welding, rebuilding, turning aircraft scrap into a weapon no Marine Corps manual had ever imagined. They finished it just in time for the invasion of Iwo Jima, when dawn broke over the transport ships carrying the 5th Marine Division toward Iwo Jima. Stein felt the weight of the weapon he had created resting across his lap. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't polished. It looked like something pieced together by a man who refused to accept the limits placed on him. But every bolt, every cut, every welded joint had a purpose. The NM2's beating heart remained untouched, a machine gun built for dogfights, bore spitting lead fast enough to shred aircraft in midair. Stein had simply given it a new body, one shaped for a Marine, sprinting across open ground under fire. He and Sergeant Gravich had spent weeks solving problems that had no instructions. The NM2's spade grips were useless on foot. So Stein cut down an M1 Garand buttstock and hollowed it to fit the aircraft gun's buffer tube. They needed a trigger system, so Stein bent and shaped scrap metal until a working solenoid trigger snapped into place. The front needed support, so Grevich welded a bar bipod beneath the barrel. They added bar sights at the rear. Piece by piece, the weapon transformed from a wrecked aircraft part into something brutal, fast, and portable. Heavy enough to control, light enough to carry. Powerful enough to change a battlefield. The men who saw it during testing called it crazy. Some called it suicidal. One joked it would blow Stein's arms off before it fired 10 rounds. But when Stein pulled the trigger during the first live test, the weapon roared to life with a sound no one had heard from a Marine's hands before an engine-like growl of pure speed. 100 rounds disappeared in 5 seconds. The recoil hammered his shoulder, but he stayed on his feet. The weapon worked. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but it worked. Word spread quickly. Some Marines shook their heads and walked away. Others whispered about the Frankenstein gun. To Stein, the name didn't matter. What mattered was that it solved the problem he'd been watching for months. It was fast, portable, devastating, and exactly what he knew the Marines would need when they hit whatever island came next. And then the operation's true name leaked across the division, Iwo Jima. The moment Stein heard it, his stomach tightened. Everyone knew Iwo Jima wasn't just another island, it was a fortress. The Japanese had been digging into it for nearly a decade. Every hole in that rock hid something deadly. Flamethrower operators speculated they'd spend the entire battle flushing tunnels. Machine gun crews predicted they'd be cut down before reaching the first ridgeline. Even the officers spoke in quiet, tense tones normally reserved for last rites. Stein kept working on his weapon. He cleaned it every night. Ran dry drills until he could swap ammunition boxes by feel alone. Practiced firing from a kneeling position, from prone, from behind cover. After dark, he and Grevich sat together, talking through the possible failures. The solenoid could jam. The bipod weld could snap. The stock might crack. The firing rate was so high it could melt the barrel if he pushed it too long. Stein memorized every risk, and he accepted each one. He didn't build the weapon to survive a normal battle. He built it for the kind of chaos Iwo Jima was promising. On the morning of February 19th, as the landing craft bucked in the surf and artillery shells exploded across the shoreline, Stein locked the ammunition box onto the gun, chambered the first round, and stared through the thick smoke drifting over the island. He could feel the heat of the weapon already, as if the machine itself understood what was coming. Machine gun fire raked the water in front of them. Marines in the next boat collapsed before their boots touched sand. The ramp slammed down. Stein stepped forward, gripped the weapon he had built from scraps of an aircraft, and ran straight into the inferno. He didn't know it yet, but within hours, the Japanese defenders would give that gun a new name, whispered in fear. A weapon they never believed a single Marine could build. A weapon they never saw coming. The moment Stein's boots sank into the volcanic ash, he understood why Marines who survived the first waves called it a nightmare. The sand wasn't sand, was hot, powdery, ankle-deep grit that dragged at every step. Ahead of him, explosions tore the beach apart in violent bursts of black smoke. Bullets hissed so fast they blurred into a constant ripping sound, like fabric being torn by a giant hand. Marines were dropping everywhere, pinned before they could even scan for targets. The air tasted like sulfur and burning metal. Stein didn't hesitate. He knew his role. The Browning teams couldn't push forward under this kind of fire. Without something heavier than a rifle leading the assault, the men around him would continue to die on the beach. He sprinted toward the next rise, gun tucked tight against his shoulder, ammunition box bouncing against his chest. Mortar blasts hammered the ground around him, showering him with shards of rock. A flaming Sherman tank burned to his left, its ammunition cooking off in deafening cracks that cut through the chaos. He slid behind a shallow depression, as a burst of machine gun fire ripped past his head. He could hear where it came from, a pillbox dug deep into the slope ahead. Invisible, except for the faint flashes of its muzzle buried behind layers of reinforced concrete. ordinary rifle fire couldn't touch it. A standard M1919 would take too long to set up or reload under that pressure. But Stein didn't bring a standard gun. He brought something the Japanese had never imagined. He peeked over the ridge. Marines were pinned flat, unable to move, unable to breathe without risking a bullet through the skull. If the pillbox continued firing, they'd be wiped out in minutes. Stein planted the bipod into the ash, drew in a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The gun erupted like a beast breaking loose. The NM2 roared with a deep, violent growl that cut through the battlefield. The recoil hammered into Stein's shoulder as the weapon spat out 100 rounds in seconds. The air in front of the barrel shimmered with heat. Trails of sparks burst from the pillbox's firing slit as the rounds smashed into the steel casement. Japanese gunners stopped firing, stunned by the sudden barrage. Marines around Stein lifted their heads, shocked at the speed and ferocity of the weapon in his hands. He reloaded with practiced speed, slamming in another ammunition box. Dust and smoke blew across the ridge as the pillbox attempted to resume firing. Stein opened up again. This time, the rounds tore chunks from the concrete face, sending fragments flying inside the slit. The Japanese inside scrambled back, their confidence shaken. No one on that island expected a Marine to be firing an aircraft gun from the hip. The silence that followed lasted only a second. But in that second, the pinned Marines surged forward. They rushed the base of the pillbox while Stein kept suppressive fire roaring overhead. A flamethrower operator sprinted through the heat and chaos, dove behind cover, then surged forward again. Stein's fire bought him every inch. With a final push, the operator pulled the trigger, sending a jet of flame into the firing slit. The pillbox went silent. Stein didn't stop. He grabbed another ammunition box, slung the gun over his shoulder, and ran again. There were more pillboxes, more tunnels, more guns hidden in that impossible maze of black volcanic stone. His weapon was overheating, his shoulder bruised, the metal scorching to the touch. But the Japanese defenders had already realized something terrifying. Someone on that beach carried a weapon far more brutal, far more mobile than anything the Marines were supposed to have, and they were about to learn what one man could do with it. The Japanese couldn't believe what they were seeing. Reports filtered back through their command. A single Marine, advancing with a weapon no one had ever seen, was cutting down men with relentless, impossible speed. At first, officers assumed it was a squad, maybe even a specialized team with experimental firepower. But patrols confirmed the horrifying truth: there was only one. One man, one gun. And somehow, that gun seemed alive. The whispers began almost immediately. Airplane gun, monster, the Marine from the sky. Soldiers on the beach exchanged panicked glances. Each pillbox they thought secure was suddenly vulnerable. Each tunnel they believed safe became a trap. Stein's crude hybrid weapon roared across the sand, scattering squads and breaking formations. He became an entire battalion's nightmare, compressed into a single figure. No one could predict his next move. No one could anticipate where the next box of ammunition would empty into their defenses. They tried to coordinate, tried to set traps, tried to surround him. Each attempt ended in chaos. Meanwhile, Marines began noticing the effect on the enemy. As Stein ripped through positions, Japanese soldiers began hesitating, their usual precision faltering. Fears spread like wildfire through the ranks. Units who had been confident in their fortified positions suddenly withdrew, seeking cover, trying to regroup. It wasn't just the weapon that terrified them. It was the audacity, the speed, the sheer unpredictability of one Marine moving like a force of nature across the volcanic beach. Stein didn't pause. He ducked behind debris, reloaded, and pressed forward. Every round he fired sent shrapnel and sand flying, forcing defenders to retreat or risk being cut down instantly. His gun roared again and again, faster than any man could run, faster than any officer could strategize. He became a phantom, a blur of motion and firepower that no one could stop. Marines around him shouted in awe, rallying from pinned positions. finally moving forward as Stein's weapon tore through enemy lines in the command tunnels. Japanese officers argued and shouted. Reinforcements were already committed, but the reports made no sense. A single Marine. Impossible, one said. Another suggested it was a trick, some secret Allied prototype. Rumors spread faster than bullets. Soldiers whispered about the ghost with the airplane gun. Morale began to crumble. Discipline faltered, and confusion took hold. Every corner of the beach seemed unsafe. Every pillbox suddenly became a death trap. For Stein, none of this was about legend or fear. Each pulse of the gun, each spray of rounds, was about survival and momentum. But the effect was undeniable. He had transformed a desperate, pinned advance into a relentless assault. One Marine? One weapon? A nightmare the Japanese would never forget. The tide of the battle was shifting. Not because of overwhelming numbers, but because ingenuity, audacity, and mechanical genius had entered the fight by midday. Whispers among the Japanese were no longer disbelief, they were terror. The Marine from the sky, armed with his deadly creation, was a living symbol of unstoppable force. And as he ran forward, firing, reloading, and pressing every advantage, he became more than a soldier. He became a story they would tell in fear for years to come. By the time the sun reached its peak over Iwo Jima, Corporal Tony Stein had already changed the battlefield. The Japanese, trained to hold every inch of that black volcanic rock, found themselves retreating in confusion. A single Marine, armed with a gun they had never imagined, had shattered their defensive lines. His homemade an M2 hybrid weapon had proven faster, deadlier, and more adaptable than anything the island's fortifications could counter. Stein's ingenuity didn't just save his life, saved dozens of his fellow Marines. Every time he fired, the gun's roar cut through the noise of mortars, rifles, and crashing waves. Marines who had been pinned down crawled forward, inspired by the power of a single man breaking the enemy's hold. The improvised weapon allowed Stein to move quickly, suppressing multiple positions at once. His strategy wasn't random. Every burst was calculated to maximize fear, chaos, and opportunity. Japanese soldiers, accustomed to methodical advances and coordinated defenses, were helpless against a force that moved faster than their bullets could track. Stein didn't have time to celebrate. After each engagement, he reloaded and pressed forward. Pillboxes were destroyed, snipers eliminated, and machine gun nests silenced. Every casualty inflicted on the enemy made the next advance easier for the Marines behind him. His weapon, once dismissed as a reckless experiment, had become a force multiplier, giving ordinary soldiers a fighting chance against a fortress designed to annihilate them. The psychological impact on the Japanese defenders was profound. Commanders found their orders ignored as men refused to hold exposed positions, terrified by the speed and lethality of Stein's attacks. The once confident gunners became cautious, slow to fire, and increasingly vulnerable. Stein's presence alone disrupted the rhythm of the entire defense. Rumors of the airplane gun Marine spread rapidly, and the enemy's fear became a weapon in its own right, for Stein and his fellow Marines. The day's successes were hard-won. He was exhausted, his body battered by recoil, heat, and the relentless pace of combat. Yet the sense of accomplishment was undeniable. The improvised gun had worked. It had saved lives, allowed Marines to push beyond the beach, and inflicted casualties far beyond what conventional arms might have achieved. The combination of courage, skill, mechanical ingenuity had turned a desperate situation into a critical tactical advantage. By the evening, after hours of continuous combat, Stein finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. Around him, the battlefield was littered with evidence of his impact. The Japanese defensive line had fractured, and the Marines were consolidating their positions inland. What began as a desperate gamble with scraps of aircraft parts had become a defining factor in the opening phase of the battle. Stein had transformed raw ingenuity into lethal action, proving that even in the most hopeless circumstances, one man with a brilliant mind and a daring heart could alter the course of history. And as the survivors looked around at the chaos he had wrought, one fact was clear. The stupid idea that had been dismissed months ago had not only worked, it had become legend. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the jagged volcanic terrain. But for Corporal Tony Stein, there was no rest. The Japanese defenders, shaken by his earlier assault, regrouped in the tunnels and pillboxes farther inland. Reinforcements had arrived, and now they were hunting him deliberately. Every ridge, every crater, every dark hollow held the threat of ambush. Yet Stein pressed forward, weapon in hand, fully aware that survival depended not just on courage, but on the lethal ingenuity that had carried him this far as he advanced. Stein's modified an M2 gun roared again and again. The rate of fire was staggering. Hundreds of rounds poured out in seconds, forcing Japanese squads to abandon their carefully dug positions. Each burst shredded sandbags, concrete, and steel, leaving defenders scrambling for cover that often didn't exist. It was a blur of motion, noise, and destruction. A single Marine moving faster than any enemy could track. The chaos he created was total. Units that had once moved like clockwork were now uncoordinated, panicked, and deadly slow to respond. Stein reached a strategic ridge overlooking a complex of interconnected tunnels. From this height, he could see dozens of enemy soldiers attempting to reinforce their positions. He planted his bipod, braced himself, and unleashed fire with calculated fury. The rounds tore into the narrow entrances of the tunnels, forcing defenders to retreat deeper underground. The sound was terrifying, continuous, mechanical roar that seemed unstoppable. From the ridge, it appeared that the gun had a mind of its own. A predator stalking a forest of steel and ash? A sudden mortar strike sent Stein sprawling, rocks and debris pelting him from all directions. But he rolled back into position, weapons still firing. Japanese soldiers tried to flank him, emerging from hidden gullies and craters. He pivoted, squeezing off bursts that cut down multiple attackers before they could even react. One by one, the enemy fell into disarray. He reloaded with practiced speed, swapping ammunition boxes like a seasoned machine operator, never letting the rhythm of his fire falter. Within the next hour, Stein had neutralized at least 20 enemy combatants. Each kill was precise, calculated, and decisive, but the impact went beyond the body count. The Japanese troops' morale shattered completely. Commanders shouted orders that were ignored, units fragmented, and coordinated attacks collapsed into chaos. The legend of the Marine with the aircraft gun grew with every round, spreading fear faster than bullets ever could by the end of the engagement. Stein stood on the ridge, panting, his hands blistered and scorched from the relentless firing. Around him, the battlefield was littered with the evidence of his brutal efficiency. Japanese soldiers had retreated or surrendered. The pillboxes that had once been impenetrable were now silent. The improvisation that began as a private project in a maintenance shed had proven itself in the crucible of battle. One man, armed with a weapon no conventional army had anticipated, had changed the course of the fight in a single, ferocious afternoon. The tide had turned, and the enemy knew it. The airplane gun Marine wasn't just a threat. He was a force of nature, predictable, unstoppable, and unforgettable. Stein had survived the impossible, not through sheer numbers or brute strength, but through ingenuity, courage, and the mechanical brilliance that transformed scrap metal into a legend by nightfall. Whispers of the airplane gun Marine had spread like wildfire among the Japanese defenders. Soldiers huddled in tunnels and foxholes, sharing hushed stories of a single Marine who moved like a phantom across the beach and ridges, wielding a gun that fired faster than any infantry weapon they had ever seen. Some officers refused to believe it. Impossible, they muttered. No one man could do this, yet the evidence was there in the shattered pillboxes, the mangled defensive positions, and the 20 bodies counted where Stein had passed. Stein, exhausted but unrelenting, used the fading light to press further inland. Each step was calculated. Every burst of fire was deliberate. The AN-M2, his monstrous creation of scrap and ingenuity, grew hotter with each magazine, but he never slowed. Behind him, Marines rallied. Where they had once crawled under enemy fire, now they surged forward, inspired by the weapon's raw power. The rhythm of Stein's fire dictated the pace of the assault. Every Japanese defensive line he encountered faltered before he even reached it. The enemy tried everything. Snipers in hidden tunnels took careful shots. Mortar teams calculated trajectories to intercept him. Small squads attempted flanking maneuvers, hoping to catch him off guard. Stein had anticipated all of it. He twisted, fired, reloaded, and advanced, blending movement and firepower into a dance that left enemies disoriented. The roar of his weapon echoed through ridges and tunnels, a terrifying mechanical voice that seemed alive. Where others might have paused, he pressed forward. Unyielding in the Japanese command posts, officers struggled to comprehend what was happening. Reports of a single Marine killing at will moved faster than reinforcements could arrive. Some believed it was a secret prototype, a weapon designed by engineers back in America. Others whispered of curses or ghosts. Soldiers themselves feared the Phantom Marine more than any artillery shell or machine gun nest. Every time Stein fired, morale crumbled further. Fear became as potent a weapon as his ammunition, leaving defenders hesitant, slow, and vulnerable. Stein's advance continued well into the evening. He cleared pillboxes, silenced machine gun nests, and forced Japanese soldiers out of their carefully constructed defenses. Each victory, though physically exhausting, compounded his legend. By now, survivors spoke of him in tones of awe and terror alike. The AN-M2, once dismissed as an impractical experiment, had proven decisive. It was faster, deadlier, and far more flexible than anything in standard issue. Stein's brilliance lay not just in mechanics, but in timing, courage, and an instinct for exploiting chaos. As darkness fell, the battlefield bore silent testimony to one Marine's relentless ingenuity. The Japanese were disoriented, broken, and terrified. Marines now moved forward with confidence, emboldened by the unstoppable force among them. And Stein? He remained a singular figure in the shadows, his weapons still ready, his mind already calculating the next move. The airplane gun Marine had become more than a soldier, he had become a legend. A symbol of what one determined man could accomplish against impossible odds by the early hours of the following morning. The impact of Corporal Tony Stein's actions was undeniable. The Japanese defensive network on the island, previously considered impenetrable, had been fractured. The once coordinated ranks of defenders now moved hesitantly, shadows of fear replacing confidence. One Marine, armed with ingenuity and a hybrid aircraft gun, had rewritten the rules of engagement. Where conventional strategy had relied on brute force and overwhelming numbers, Stein's daring innovation had created leverage that no command plan could anticipate. Stein himself was exhausted. His uniform was scorched in places from the constant heat of the weapon, his shoulders bruised from relentless recoil, and every muscle in his body screamed from hours of sprinting, crouching, and firing. Yet, despite the fatigue, he understood the significance of what he had done. The improvised M2 had not only allowed him to survive, it had enabled him to save countless lives around him. Marines who had been pinned to the sand, staring death in the face, were now advancing inland, emboldened by the roar and devastation of Stein's gun. His ingenuity had turned the tide of what could have been a catastrophic opening phase of the battle. The psychological effects on the Japanese were equally profound. Commanders discovered their orders ignored as fear took hold. Small units retreated or refused to fire, unsure if another assault by the so-called airplane gun Marine would strike them next. The terror he inspired was as effective as the weapon itself. Panic spread faster than bullets, eroding morale and cohesion. Stein's actions had created a battlefield advantage that went beyond physical firepower. It became a strategic tool, a psychological weapon that shifted the momentum of an entire engagement in the aftermath of the assault. As Marines regrouped behind him, Stein allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. Around him lay the evidence of his effectiveness: destroyed pillboxes, abandoned defensive positions, and casualties inflicted on the enemy. The weapon that had once seemed impossible, a crude amalgamation of aircraft parts and ingenuity, had proven decisive. What began as an audacious experiment in a quiet maintenance shed had transformed into a battlefield reality that no one in the 28th Marines could ignore. Commanders and fellow Marines alike were stunned. Stein's stupid idea, once ridiculed, had redefined the parameters of what a single soldier could accomplish. The lessons were clear. Creativity, courage, and mechanical skill could amplify human potential far beyond conventional limits. Stein had demonstrated that in the chaos of war, the mind could be just as lethal as firepower by the time reinforcements pushed further inland. The legend of the airplane gun Marine had already begun to spread. His actions were talked about in hushed tones, analyzed by officers, and marveled at by his fellow soldiers. He had survived against staggering odds, and in doing so, had turned a desperate gamble into a decisive advantage. The impact of one man, one weapon, and unyielding determination would be remembered long after the echoes of battle faded, a testament to ingenuity's power in the most impossible of circumstances. In the days following the opening assault on Iwo Jima, the story of Corporal Tony Stein and his improvised aircraft gun spread throughout the 5th Marine Division. Fellow Marines recounted the terrifying efficiency with which he had carved through the enemy lines, often embellishing details, but never overstating the fear his weapon had instilled in the Japanese defenders. Officers noted that positions previously deemed impregnable had fallen more easily than expected, and that morale among Stein's fellow soldiers had soared. The chaotic, brutal effectiveness of one man had left an undeniable mark on both sides of the battlefield. Stein himself moved with a quiet focus. He had little time for accolades. Each day brought new objectives, new positions to secure, and new waves of enemy resistance. Yet the battle had changed him. The weapon he had built, which began as a secret experiment in a maintenance shed, has become a symbol of ingenuity, courage, and sheer audacity. It had proven that one soldier, armed with knowledge and resourcefulness, could shape the course of a fight in ways that conventional planning never anticipated. His role on the island had grown beyond that of a rifleman. He had become a force multiplier, capable of altering tactical outcomes on a scale that rivaled entire units. Meanwhile, the Japanese defenders, already shaken by Stein's actions, faced the psychological repercussions. Soldiers whispered among themselves about the Marine who seemed unstoppable, who struck where and when he pleased. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion, as fear undermined discipline and slowed reinforcements. Every encounter with Stein or his gun was a reminder that even the most fortified positions could be vulnerable to creativity and daring. In many ways, his weapon had become more than metal and mechanics. It had become a legend that carried its own weight on the battlefield. The broader strategic implications were clear to those studying the engagement later. Stein's actions had shown the value of improvisation in extreme combat situations. Conventional doctrine could only take a force so far, but ingenuity could multiply its effectiveness exponentially. His work inspired discussions among engineers, officers, and historians about how adaptability and personal initiative could shape outcomes in ways raw numbers and firepower could not. In the heat of war, the difference between survival and annihilation sometimes came down to ideas as much as arms. By the time the Battle of Iwo Jima progressed inland, Stein had already etched his place into the memory of the division. His hybrid aircraft gun, once a stupid idea, had not only saved lives, but had redefined what a Marine could do when necessity demanded it. Reports continued to circulate, blending fact with legend, of a single figure who moved like a shadow across the battlefield, firing with a machine gun built from scraps and courage. And even as reinforcements and standard weaponry joined the fight, the story of Stein and his invention lingered in every mind. A haunting reminder that ingenuity could strike where brute force alone might fail. The island remained a deadly crucible. But the influence of one determined Marine was undeniable. Tony Stein's presence, his audacity, and his mechanical brilliance had shifted the battlefield, leaving behind a ripple of fear, respect, and inspiration that would last long after the ash of Iwo Jima settled. By the time the smoke cleared over Iwo Jima, Corporal Tony Stein had become more than a Marine. He had become a legend. His hybrid aircraft gun, born from scraps, ingenuity, and desperation, had reshaped the battlefield. Where others relied on doctrine and numbers, Stein relied on his mind, his hands, and his courage. One man, armed with an idea and a machine, had changed the tide of a fight that seemed unwinnable. Fellow Marines remembered him not only for the destruction he wrought, but for the hope he inspired. Pin squads found the courage to advance. Officers recognized the value of improvisation. And the Japanese defenders carried with them the haunting memory of a single soldier whose speed, precision, and audacity seemed impossible. Stein had proven that in the chaos of war, ingenuity could be as deadly as firepower, determination as powerful as strategy. Yet, amid the acclaim and awe, Stein remained the same man who had cut, welded, and built his weapon in the quiet of a maintenance shed months earlier. He had not sought glory. He had sought survival, momentum, and the chance to protect those around him. In doing so, he had left a legacy that would echo far beyond Iwo Jima. The story of the airplane gun Marine became a symbol, a testament to what one individual could accomplish when faced with impossible odds. His courage and brilliance reminded every soldier and every historian that war is not only won with numbers and machines, but also with the human mind, the spark of creativity, the refusal to accept limitations, the daring to make the impossible real. Tony Stein's fight on Iwo Jima was over, but his legend endured. One man, one weapon, one audacious idea had left an indelible mark on history's story of ingenuity, bravery, and the extraordinary power of a determined mind in the heart of war.